This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. He thought speaking Italian would make her feel small, but he had no idea she understood every single word. The chandelier light shimmered against crystal glasses and polished marble as Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, one arm resting casually over the back, as if the entire private dining room belonged to him. At 38, he carried the quiet authority of a man whose net worth could buy the building twice over without checking the price. His tailored charcoal suit fit like precision engineering. His watch caught the light in deliberate flashes, and his voice, smooth and controlled, shifted effortlessly into rapid Italian as he glanced at the menu without really seeing it. The two executives across from him chuckled, impressed, eager to match his tone, but when he tilted his head slightly toward the waitress standing beside the table, his words sharpened just enough to cut. "Let's see if she keeps up," he said in Italian, a faint smirk touching the corner of his mouth. Clara Whitmore stood still, not rigid, not flustered, simply present. Her white blouse was pressed, her dark apron neatly tied, and her blonde hair was pulled back into a low, practical knot. She had been on her feet for nearly 9 hours, moving between tables with quiet efficiency, refilling glasses before they were empty, clearing plates before anyone had to ask. Most customers never looked at her long enough to notice the calm steadiness in her gray eyes. Ethan did not expect her to notice the nuance in his accent, or the subtle mispronunciation that marked him as someone who had learned the language in boardrooms rather than on the streets of Florence. He continued speaking, deliberately faster now, describing the wine selection in exaggerated tones as if narrating a performance. One of the executives laughed again, glancing at Clara with polite dismissal. She finished pouring the sparkling water, set the bottle down with precise grace, and then, in fluent Italian softened by the cadence of Tuscany rather than Manhattan, she replied, "If you'd prefer the Brullo, sir, it pairs better with the ribeye than the Chianti. And the way you just said it would actually mean barn instead of oak barrel." The laughter died instantly. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around his glass. He did not move, but something shifted in his posture, subtle and unmistakable. Clara's tone had not risen. She had not smiled in triumph. She had simply corrected him the way one might adjust a crooked picture frame. Silence expanded across the table, thick but not uncomfortable. One of the executives cleared his throat. Ethan studied her now, really studied her, noticing the composure in her shoulders, the steadiness of her breathing, the complete absence of apology in her stance. "You speak Italian," he said, switching back to English, his voice lower. "Yes, sir," she answered evenly. Among others. The words landed lightly, but their weight lingered. He leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Where did you learn?" She did not hesitate. "My father was a translator. I grew up listening." There was no elaboration, no invitation for sympathy. She picked up her order pad. "Are you ready to place your order?" Ethan held her gaze a second longer than necessary. He was used to commanding rooms, to watching people adjust their tone around him, soften their opinions, stretch their smiles. Clara had done none of that. She had not bristled. She had not bowed. She had simply answered. He shifted back into Italian again, testing her, this time discussing a contract clause with his colleagues as if she were invisible. It was a subtle challenge, layered in corporate terminology and regional phrasing designed to intimidate. Clara listened as she set down the breadbasket. When he misinterpreted a phrase about distribution rights, she paused, then spoke gently, again in Italian, clarifying the distinction between exclusive territories and limited licensing in a way that was both precise and undeniably correct. Ethan's jaw stilled. The executives exchanged glances, impressed now for a different reason. She had not only understood, she had comprehended context. He exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. "That's enough," he said quietly, not to silence her, but to steady himself. Clara nodded once, as if the exchange had been entirely ordinary. "I'll place your order," she said, returning to English. As she stepped away, Ethan watched the measured confidence in her stride. There had been no tremor in her hands, no defensive edge in her tone. She had not translated insults. She had translated meaning. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't anger. It was curiosity, sharp and undeniable. He had meant to perform. Instead, He had been corrected without spectacle. He had tried to create distance. She had closed it with a single sentence. Across the dining room, Clara moved between tables, the warm hum of conversation rising again as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Ethan no longer saw a background figure in a black apron. He saw a woman who had chosen not to humiliate him in return, who had delivered precision without cruelty, who had spoken in his language yet refused to play his game. And as the soft clink of silverware resumed and the scent of seared steak drifted from the kitchen, he realized that the evening he intended as a display of dominance had quietly become something else entirely. Something unexpected. Something he could not control. Ethan did not return to his conversation immediately after Clara left the table. He watched her cross the dining room, balancing two plates effortlessly as if nothing significant had just occurred, as if correcting a billionaire in his own chosen language was part of the evening routine. The executives resumed discussing quarterly projections, their voices cautious now, their earlier amusement replaced with a subtle respect that was no longer directed entirely at him. Ethan straightened slightly, regaining his composure. He had built companies from the ground up. He had negotiated deals in 3 countries before the age of 30. He did not rattle easily. And yet, the steadiness in Clara's voice lingered in his mind more than any financial figure on the table. When she returned with their entrees, the scent of seared ribeye and rosemary rising into the air, she placed each plate with quiet precision. "Medium rare, as requested," she said. Her tone was professional, neither distant nor warm. Ethan waited until his colleagues were distracted with their first bites before speaking again. "You mentioned you speak others," he said, his voice lower, more measured. Clara met his gaze briefly. "A few," she replied. "French, Farsi, some German." He lifted an eyebrow. "That is not common for someone working in a restaurant." The statement could have been an insult. It was not delivered as one. Clara did not flinch. "It is common for someone who listens," she answered softly. He studied her again, searching for defensiveness, for pride, for any sign that she was performing. There was none. "Sit," he said impulsively, gesturing to the empty chair at the end of the table. "Explain something to me." She remained standing. "I cannot sit while I am on shift." The refusal was calm, respectful, and absolute. Ethan felt the faintest curve of a smile threaten at the corner of his mouth. No one declined his invitations without hesitation. "Then stand," he said. "Tell me why you corrected the contract phrasing." Clara glanced at the executives, then back at Ethan. "Because you were about to agree to a limited distribution clause disguised as exclusive territory rights." The wording was subtle. "It would have restricted your expansion on the West Coast by at least 2 years. One of the executives froze mid-bite. Ethan leaned back slowly. "You read contracts too?" "I read language," she replied. The simplicity of the answer settled over the table. Ethan's mind moved quickly now, replaying the phrasing he had skimmed earlier. She was right. He knew she was right. The clause had been layered beneath translation nuance, hidden in terminology that most would not question. "You just saved me several $1,000,000, he said quietly. Clara shook her head once. I corrected a sentence. The distinction struck him harder than any boast would have. After she stepped away again, Ethan barely tasted his meal. His thoughts circled around her composure, the absence of hunger for recognition. He had encountered brilliant analysts who demanded credit before the ink dried. Clara had asked for nothing. When dinner concluded, his colleagues excused themselves, offering quick handshakes and careful goodbyes. Ethan remained seated. The restaurant had begun to thin, the late evening crowd softer, conversations gentler. Clara approached with the check folder, placing it on the table. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked. He looked up at her. For a moment, the polished confidence slipped, replaced by something more genuine. "Yes," he said. "I need to understand why you are here." She tilted her head slightly. "I work here." "That is not what I meant." Silence stretched between them, not tense but deliberate. Clara considered him, as if measuring whether he deserved the truth. "Because life does not always follow resumes," she said at last. "And because not everyone who can speak in a boardroom needs to." The words were not bitter. They were simply honest. Ethan stood, buttoning his jacket slowly. "If I asked you to consult," he began, then paused. He caught himself. The old reflex. Offer money. Offer position. Solve the puzzle with acquisition. Clara watched him catch that instinct. "I do not translate humiliation," she said gently. And I do not translate ego. The air shifted again, but this time there was no audience, no executives to impress. Just the two of them beneath the dim light of a nearly empty dining room. Ethan exhaled softly. What do you translate? He asked. Clara's expression softened just slightly, the first crack in her careful neutrality. Meaning, she said. He nodded once, absorbing that. For the first time in years, he did not know what to say next. She handed him the receipt, their fingers brushing briefly, not charged, not dramatic, just human. He signed without looking at the total. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, quieter now. Clara. She paused. Yes. If I come back tomorrow, he said carefully. An order in English. Would you still correct me? A hint of amusement flickered in her gray eyes. If you need it, she answered. And as she walked away, Ethan realized that he had spent years mastering languages to gain leverage, to impress, to dominate rooms. She had mastered them to protect clarity, to guard truth, to preserve dignity. And for the first time in a very long while, he was not interested in winning the conversation. He was interested in learning how to listen. Ethan did not sleep much that night. The city outside his penthouse windows hummed with the distant rhythm of traffic and late trains, but his mind replayed a different sound entirely. The steady cadence of Clara's voice correcting him without hesitation and without cruelty. By morning, the contract draft lay open across his glass desk, red annotations marking the clause she had identified. She had been precise. More precise than two of his senior legal advisors. He closed the file slowly and stared at his reflection in the dark screen of his tablet. He had built his empire on anticipation, on reading people before they read him. Yet he had misjudged her within seconds. That unsettled him more than the financial oversight ever could. By 7:30 that evening, he found himself standing once again beneath the restaurant's chandelier, this time without executives, without an audience. He wore a navy blazer instead of charcoal, no tie, no performance. The hostess recognized him immediately, her smile quick and polished. Table for one, Mr. Caldwell? She asked. Yes, he replied, then added after a brief pause, wherever she is serving. The hostess hesitated only a fraction of a second before guiding him toward a smaller table near the windows overlooking the street. Clara was already there, setting down fresh silverware. She looked up, and for a moment her expression did not change at all. Then something softer flickered in her eyes. Not surprise, not approval, simply acknowledgement. Good evening, she said. English tonight? He asked lightly. That depends, she answered. On what? On whether you intend to listen. He almost smiled. I am here to do exactly that. She handed him the menu, but he did not open it. I reviewed the contract, he said. You were right. I know. She replied gently, not boastful, simply factual. You saved me from a very expensive mistake. Clara folded her hands loosely in front of her apron. I corrected language, she said again, as if repeating a principle rather than seeking credit. Why did you not say something sooner? He asked. Because you were not asking, she said. The answer lingered between them, honest and unadorned. He leaned back slightly. Then I am asking now. Not about the contract. About you. Clara regarded him for a long moment. The restaurant buzzed quietly around them, plates clinking, glasses chiming softly, but their table felt still. My father worked as a translator for international conferences, she said at last. I grew up hearing 5 languages at the dinner table. Words were currency in our house. Precision mattered. Ethan listened without interruption. When he passed away, she continued, I kept studying. Scholarships, night classes, freelance translation work. But my mother became ill. Hospital bills do not accept eloquence as payment. Her tone remained steady, but something in her eyes carried history. So you stepped away? Ethan said quietly. I stepped sideways, she corrected. There is a difference. He nodded slowly. You do not seem resentful. Clara tilted her head slightly. Resentment is another language. I chose not to become fluent. The corners of his mouth lifted before he could stop himself. You speak in metaphors, even in English. It is efficient, she replied. A server passed behind her, and she shifted slightly to let him through, then returned her focus to Ethan. Why are you really here? She asked. He considered the question carefully. Because I realized last night that I have spent years speaking to impress rooms instead of connecting with people. And you did not seem impressed. I was not, she said calmly. He exhaled softly. That is new for me. It should not be, she replied. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, simply reflective. He opened the menu this time, scanning it without urgency. What would you recommend, he asked. The salmon, she said. And humility. He laughed quietly, the sound genuine, unguarded. I will take both. As she wrote the order, he studied the concentration in her expression, the careful curve of her handwriting. If I asked you to consult, he began again. But this time there was no arrogance in the offer. Not as an employee, not as a display, but as a partner in clarity. Would you consider it? Clara paused, pen hovering slightly above the page. On one condition, she said. Name it. You do not hire me to validate your intelligence. You hire me to challenge it. He met her gaze steadily. Agreed. She nodded once. Then we can talk. When she returned with his dinner, he noticed the way she set the plate down with the same composed precision as the night before, yet something had shifted. There was less distance in her posture, less armor in his. You asked what I translate, she said quietly as she adjusted his water glass. Yes. I translate fear into clarity, she continued. People hide behind language when they feel small, when they feel threatened, when they want to seem larger than they are. The words landed gently but carried unmistakable weight. Ethan did not look away. I spoke Italian to feel larger, he admitted. Yes, she said. There was no accusation in her tone, only recognition. He rested his hands lightly on the table. And you answered to make the room equal. Clara considered that. Something like that. Outside the window, headlights traced slow lines across the pavement, reflections shimmering against the glass. Inside, the noise of the restaurant seemed softer than before. If I come back again, he said, his voice quieter now, more personal than polished. Not as a client, but as someone who wants to learn how to speak without armor. Would you sit with me after your shift? Clara held his gaze, weighing not the invitation but the intention behind it. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. If you are ready to listen, she said, I might. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Caldwell felt no need to perform, no need to dominate the silence. Only the steady awareness that meaning, when spoken honestly, could change everything. Clara's shift ended at 10:15 that night. The last of the dessert plates cleared, and the dining room lights dimmed to a softer glow. Ethan remained at his table long after his salmon had cooled, not scrolling through his phone, not answering emails, simply waiting without the restless energy that usually followed him like a second shadow. When Clara untied her apron behind the service station, smoothing the fabric of her blouse before stepping out from behind the counter, he stood automatically, not out of habit, but out of respect. She approached the table without hurry, her movements unguarded now that the performance of service had ended. You stayed, she said quietly. I said I would, he replied. There was no arrogance in his voice, only steadiness. The restaurant manager offered Clara a nod as she passed, accustomed to late conversations between guests and staff in a city that rarely slept. Clara slipped her coat over her shoulders, a simple wool blend the color of slate, and glanced toward Ethan. There is a coffee shop 2 blocks down, she said. They stay open until midnight. He did not suggest somewhere more exclusive. He simply followed her out into the cool evening air. The city felt different at that hour, less sharp, more reflective. Streetlights pooled softly across the sidewalk, and the hum of traffic carried a quieter rhythm. They walked side by side, neither rushing to fill the silence. Inside the coffee shop, the air smelled of roasted beans and warm milk. A single barista worked behind the counter, music playing low enough to be felt rather than heard. Clara ordered chamomile tea. Ethan ordered black coffee. They chose a small table near the window, facing each other without the barrier of white tablecloths or polished crystal. This is where you learn to listen? Clara asked gently. Ethan folded his hands loosely on the table. I am trying. She studied him, not suspicious, not impressed, simply attentive. Why now, she asked. He considered the question carefully before answering. Because last night you corrected me without trying. To embarrass me. Most people would have. Clara wrapped her hands around her cup, the steam rising between them. Humiliation is inefficient, she said. It closes people. It does not change them. He nodded slowly. And you think I can change? She held his gaze. Everyone can. The question is whether they are willing to feel smaller before they grow. The words settled into him, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. He looked down briefly, then back up. When I was younger, he said, his voice lower now, less controlled. I was the one who felt small. Scholarships, hand-me-down suits, rooms where everyone else inherited what I was still building. I learned languages so I would never be the least prepared person in the room again. Clara listened without interrupting. And somewhere along the way, he continued, preparation became armor. She nodded once. Armor keeps you safe, she said. But it also keeps people out. He exhaled softly. I do not want to be untouchable. The admission lingered between them, honest and unpolished. Clara's expression softened, not with pity, but with understanding. You are not, she said quietly. You just forgot how to stand without protection. The barista called out an order number, the small sound grounding the moment in something ordinary. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying the way the light from the street reflected in Clara's gray eyes. And you? He asked. You speak like someone who has been disappointed but not hardened. Clara smiled faintly. I have been disappointed, she said. By circumstances. By timing. Not by language. He tilted his head. What does that mean? She traced the rim of her cup lightly with one finger, thoughtful. Language is honest if you listen carefully. It reveals intention. I have learned to trust intention more than position. He absorbed that slowly. So you did not judge me by my suit, he said. No, she replied. I judged you by how you used your words. Silence followed, comfortable now, almost warm. Outside, a taxi rolled past, headlights streaking across the glass. If I am willing to learn, he said carefully, not just languages, but how to speak without making others feel small, would you teach me? Clara's eyes searched his, measuring sincerity rather than status. I do not teach, she said at last. I practice. If you want to learn, you practice with me. The simplicity of the offer carried more weight than any formal agreement. Ethan felt something shift inside him, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady and certain. Then let us practice, he said. Clara's smile deepened slightly, still subtle, still controlled, but undeniably present. They spoke for nearly an hour, not about contracts or investments, but about childhood dinners filled with multiple languages, about public libraries where Ethan once studied until closing time, about the difference between speaking to win and speaking to understand. The conversation moved easily, without calculation. When they finally stepped back onto the sidewalk, the air had grown cooler, the city quieter still. Clara pulled her coat closer around her shoulders. Ethan hesitated only a second before offering his arm, not possessive, not showy, simply courteous. She accepted without comment. They walked slowly toward the subway entrance near her apartment. At the top of the stairs, she turned to him. You listened tonight, she said. I tried, he replied. She studied him one last time, then nodded once. Come back tomorrow, she said. Not to test me, not to impress me, just come back. He met her gaze, no performance left, only intention. I will. As she descended the steps, disappearing into the quiet rhythm of the underground train, Ethan remained standing for a moment beneath the streetlight. For the first time in years, he did not feel the need to conquer the evening or calculate its return. He felt something far simpler and far rarer. He felt equal. And as he turned to walk home through the softened glow of the city, he understood that some conversations do not elevate one person above another. They bring two people to the same level, where meaning is shared, and something quieter, something deeper, begins to grow. Ethan returned the next evening without reservation and without announcement, stepping into the restaurant just after 7 as the early dinner crowd settled into its steady rhythm. He did not scan the room with the assessing gaze of a man evaluating an investment. He looked for her. Clara stood near the window section, speaking softly to an elderly couple, her posture relaxed, her smile unforced. When she noticed him, she did not appear surprised. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a promise kept. He chose a small table in her section and waited without reaching for his phone. When she approached, there was no tension in her shoulders, no guarded stillness. Good evening, she said. Good evening, he replied. Practice. A faint hint of amusement touched her expression. Practice, she confirmed. He ordered simply, no performance, no foreign phrases layered for effect. As she poured his water, he spoke again, his tone thoughtful rather than strategic. I had a meeting this afternoon, he said. I caught myself interrupting someone mid-sentence. I stopped, Clara glanced at him, assessing the sincerity behind the statement. And, she asked. He had a better idea than mine, Ethan admitted. I would have missed it. She set the pitcher down gently. Listening is expensive, she said. It costs pride. He almost smiled. I am beginning to understand that. Throughout the meal, their conversation moved lightly between topics, no longer circling around correction or contracts, but exploring smaller details. Clara spoke about translating documents for a community center on weekends, helping new immigrants navigate legal forms and school enrollment paperwork. Ethan listened, not offering to fund it, not offering to fix it, simply absorbing the quiet dedication in her voice. You do that after working double shifts? He asked. She shrugged slightly. Meaning does not wait for convenience. The phrase lingered with him. When her shift ended, she joined him again for coffee, this time at a small corner table inside the restaurant after closing. The lights were dimmed lower now, the space intimate but not private. Why did you come back? She asked again. Not suspicious, simply curious. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. Because I realized I do not want to impress you, he said. I want to deserve you. The honesty in his voice was unpolished, stripped of rehearsed confidence. Clara held his gaze, searching for calculation and finding none. Deserve is a strong word, she said softly. So is love, he replied before he could stop himself. The words settled between them, unexpected yet not unwelcome. He did not retract it. He did not soften it. He let it remain, vulnerable and unshielded. Clara's breath slowed, not startled but aware of the weight behind what he had said. You barely know me, she replied gently. I know how you speak, he answered. I know how you refuse to make people feel small. I know that you correct without cruelty and challenge without arrogance. That is more than I have known. About many people for years. Silence expanded around them, not empty but full. Clara looked down briefly at her hands, then back up at him. Love is not language alone, she said. It is consistency. Then let me be consistent, he said quietly. Not grand gestures. Not expensive dinners. Just showing up. Listening. Learning. She studied him, the quiet intensity in his expression, the absence of bravado. Why me? She asked at last. Ethan exhaled softly, considering the simplest truth. Because when you speak, I feel equal, he said. Not admired. Not feared. Equal. And I have not felt that in a long time. Her expression softened, the careful composure easing into something warmer. Equality is not given, she said. It is chosen. Then I choose it, he replied. The words were steady, deliberate. Clara reached for her tea, then paused, her fingers brushing his hand briefly on the table. The contact was gentle, unhurried, a quiet acknowledgement rather than a dramatic declaration. If you choose equality, she said softly, you choose partnership. Yes, he answered without hesitation. The certainty in his voice carried no dominance, only intention. She watched him for a moment longer, then allowed a small, genuine smile to surface, one that reached her eyes fully this time. Then we practiced together, she said. He felt the words settle into him with unexpected clarity. Not conquest, not persuasion. Practice, growth, shared space. The restaurant lights dimmed further as the manager signaled closing time. Ethan stood, offering his hand not as a command but as an invitation. Clara placed her hand in his willingly. They stepped outside into the cool night air once more, the city quieter than usual, the streetlights casting long reflections across the pavement. I am not impressed by wealth, she said as they began walking slowly down the block. I am impressed by effort. He nodded. Then I will keep showing up. She glanced at him sideways, her expression thoughtful. And if I challenge you, she asked. Then I will thank you, he replied. She stopped walking for a moment, turning fully toward him. The noise of the city seemed distant, the world narrowed to the steady exchange between them. I am not easy, she said. I do not want easy, he answered. The simplicity of that truth lingered. Clara's smile deepened, no longer restrained. She stepped closer, not dramatically, not hurried, simply closing the space between them. Then we begin honestly, she said. No armor. No armor, he echoed. And under the quiet glow of the city lights, without spectacle or applause, without contracts or languages layered for advantage, Ethan Caldwell and Clara Whitmore chose something far rarer than dominance or admiration. They chose each other, not because one had won the exchange, but because both had learned how to stand equal within it. The next morning felt different, not because the city had changed, but because Ethan had. He stood in his office overlooking the skyline, sunlight stretching across the glass walls, and for once he was not thinking about market openings or acquisition targets. He was thinking about consistency, about showing up without armor. His assistant entered with a tablet in hand, outlining a schedule filled with meetings, investor calls, and a lunch reservation at an exclusive private club. Ethan glanced at it, then shook his head gently. "Reschedule the lunch," he said. "I have another commitment." By late afternoon, he found himself walking into a modest brick building 3 blocks from the restaurant. A small sign near the door read Community Language Outreach Center. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a whiteboard listed phrases in English alongside translations in Spanish and Farsi. Clara stood near the front, sleeves rolled to her elbows, explaining the difference between literal translation and intended meaning to a small group of adults holding printed forms. She did not notice him at first. He stayed near the back, listening. Her voice carried calm authority, not loud, not commanding, but clear. "If the form says permanent address," she explained gently, "it means where you live now, not where you were born. Context changes everything." A woman in the front row nodded with relief, correcting her paperwork. Ethan watched the quiet impact of Clara's patience, the way confusion softened into understanding. This was not a boardroom. There were no polished shoes or tailored suits. Just people trying to navigate a language that did not always welcome them. When the session ended, Clara gathered the papers neatly, then finally looked up and saw him standing there. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by something warmer. "You came," she said softly. "You said meaning does not wait for convenience," he replied. She stepped toward him, lowering her voice. "This is not glamorous. Neither is growth," he answered. She studied him for a moment, then gestured toward a stack of folders. "If you are here to practice, you can start by helping me organize these." There was no ceremony, no applause. Ethan rolled up his sleeves and began sorting documents by language and deadline. For over an hour, he worked beside her, asking questions when unsure, listening when she corrected his assumptions about phrasing. At one point, he misinterpreted a line in a housing application. Clara gently adjusted his understanding. "You are still translating for advantage," she said quietly. "Try translating for clarity." He paused, absorbing the distinction. "Show me," he said. She leaned closer, pointing to the line, explaining not just the words but the intention behind them. He listened carefully, the way he once listened for market shifts, but now for human nuance. When the last folder was placed in its cabinet, the room felt lighter. The other volunteers had already left, the evening sky turning shades of deep blue through the windows. Clara sat on the edge of a desk, watching him thoughtfully. "You did not try to take over," she said. "I am learning," he replied. She smiled faintly. "You are." He stepped closer, resting his hands lightly on the desk beside her, not trapping her, not claiming space, simply present. "This matters to you," he said. "Very much." "Then it matters to me," he answered. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic music swelling behind them, only the steady recognition of shared intention. Clara's eyes searched his face again, not for status, not for charm, but for consistency. "You are different here," she observed. "I am trying to be the same everywhere," he said. The honesty in his voice carried weight. She reached for his hand then, not tentative, not theatrical, simply choosing connection. Their fingers intertwined naturally, the gesture quiet but decisive. "Partnership," she reminded him softly. "Partnership," he echoed. Outside, a bus rumbled past, its headlights sweeping across the wall briefly before fading. The room fell into comfortable silence. "When you first walked into that restaurant," she said after a moment, "I thought you were another man who measured value in dollars." He met her gaze steadily. "I did," he admitted. "And now?" she asked. He did not hesitate. "Now I measure it in effort, in how someone makes others feel, in whether they build or diminish." Clara's expression softened fully, the last of her guarded caution easing away. "You listened," she said. "You practiced." "I will keep practicing," he replied. She slid off the desk, standing directly in front of him. There was no distance left between them, not physical, not emotional. "Then we move forward," she said. He brushed a loose strand of hair gently away from her face, the gesture tender and respectful. Together, he said. And in that small community center, surrounded by translated forms and folding chairs, without audience or applause, they sealed something deeper than attraction. They chose a shared language built not on dominance or display, but on clarity, effort, and mutual respect. The billionaire who once spoke foreign words to feel larger now spoke simply to understand. And the waitress who answered without raising her voice found in him not a man to correct, but a partner willing to learn. 2 weeks later, the boardroom felt different, and so did Ethan. The long walnut table reflected the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, and 12 executives sat with tablets open, waiting for him to begin. In the past, he would have opened in flawless German to impress the European investors joining by video call. He would have set the tone, controlled the rhythm, owned the silence. Today he paused. He looked around the table and then toward the large screen where the overseas partners waited. Before we begin, he said calmly, we are going to take this one step at a time. If something is unclear, we clarify it. No assumptions. No ego. A few eyebrows lifted subtly. This was not his usual entrance. The call began. One of the investors shifted into rapid German, outlining projected logistics concerns. Ethan understood every word. He could have answered immediately, displayed precision, regained dominance. Instead, he glanced toward the end of the table where Clara sat, not as a waitress, not as decoration, but as an invited consultant. She wore a simple navy dress, professional and understated, her posture steady. Clara, Ethan said evenly, would you walk us through the nuance of that last point? The room quieted. She nodded once, her voice calm as she translated not only the literal phrasing, but the implied hesitation beneath it. They are not questioning capacity, she explained. They are questioning trust and distribution consistency. The distinction shifted the entire tone of the discussion. Ethan listened, absorbing the way she reframed the issue. Then we address trust, he said, not defensively, but collaboratively. For the next hour, he did not interrupt. He did not dominate. He listened, asked, clarified. And when he spoke in German at one point to confirm a detail, his tone was not sharpened for effect. It was steady, respectful. Clara noticed the difference. When the meeting ended successfully, one of his senior partners lingered behind. You are different lately, the man observed carefully. Ethan glanced toward Clara, who was organizing her notes at the far end of the table. I am practicing, he replied simply. Later that evening, they stepped out of the corporate building into the warm glow of early summer light. The city felt alive but unhurried. Clara walked beside him, thoughtful. You did not need to speak German at all, she said. But when you did, you chose the right moment. He smiled faintly. I am learning timing. She looked at him, the quiet pride in her expression unmistakable. You are learning balance, she corrected gently. They stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, waiting for the crosswalk signal. It was important to me, he said after a moment, that you were at that table. Clara tilted her head slightly. Why? Because partnership means visibility, he answered. Not behind the scenes. Not hidden. The crosswalk light shifted to white, and they crossed slowly with the crowd. On the other side, she stopped walking. You are not trying to impress me, she said softly. No, he replied. I am trying to build something with you. The honesty in his voice carried no hesitation now. Weeks of practice had removed the need for armor. She studied him carefully, searching for the familiar signs of ambition overtaking sincerity. She found none. And if building with me means building differently, she asked. Then differently is better, he answered. A breeze moved gently through the street, lifting a strand of her hair. He reached up instinctively, brushing it back with careful tenderness. The gesture was not dramatic. It was intimate in its simplicity. When I first met you, she said quietly, I thought you were trying to make yourself larger. I was, he admitted. And now, she asked. He stepped closer, not to dominate space, but to share it. Now I am trying to make room. Her breath softened. The city noise seemed to fade. Into the background. Room for what? She whispered. For you, he said. There was no flourish in the declaration, no theatrical pause. Just truth. Clara felt the steadiness of it, the consistency he had promised and kept. He had shown up. He had listened. He had changed in visible, measurable ways. I do not need perfection, she said gently. I need presence. You have it, he replied. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his naturally. Then we keep practicing, she said. Not because we are incomplete, but because growth never stops. He nodded, understanding that love, like language, required attention and care. They walked together toward the small park across the street, finding a quiet bench beneath a tree whose leaves filtered the evening light into soft patterns on the pavement. Do you regret that night? She asked suddenly, her tone curious rather than accusing. He shook his head slowly. No, he said. It was the first time someone answered me without fear. It forced me to see myself clearly. She smiled faintly. And you did not look away. Not anymore, he said. He turned slightly toward her, his voice lowering with sincerity. I do not love you because you corrected me. I love you because you refused to diminish yourself to protect my ego. And because you invited me to become better instead of walking away. Her eyes held his, steady and unguarded. I love you, she replied softly, the words calm but certain. There was no rush in the moment. No spectacle. Just two people who had chosen clarity over performance, effort over dominance, equality over display. He leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, respectful and unhurried. The city continued around them, unaware that something profound had shifted. The billionaire who once used language to elevate himself now used it to connect. The waitress who once corrected him across a white tablecloth now stood beside him in boardrooms and community centers alike. And as they sat there beneath the fading light, hands intertwined, they understood that love was not the loudest language in the room. It was the quiet one that remained when everything else fell silent. The weeks that followed did not feel dramatic. There were no headlines, no grand announcements, no sudden transformation that impressed the world overnight. Instead, there was rhythm. Ethan still walked into boardrooms with measured confidence, but now there was a pause before he spoke, a breath that allowed others to enter the conversation first. Clara still worked evening shifts at the restaurant, not because she had to anymore, but because she chose to finish what she started, because loyalty mattered to her as much as language. On a warm Saturday afternoon, they stood side by side in the community center once more, this time preparing for a larger event. Flyers had been posted around the neighborhood offering free translation assistance for small business owners navigating permit applications. Folding tables were arranged in neat rows, and a steady line of people began to form near the entrance. Ethan carried in a box of printed forms, setting them down without fanfare. He wore a simple light blue button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, no watch flashing under fluorescent lights. Clara moved through the room with quiet focus, greeting each person with patience. Take your time, she told an older man holding a stack of documents. We will go through it together. Ethan watched her for a moment before stepping into place beside her. How can I help? He asked, not rhetorically. She handed him a folder. Start here. And remember, clarity over speed. He nodded. As the afternoon unfolded, he found himself translating a Spanish lease agreement line by line, occasionally glancing toward Clara for confirmation. When he stumbled over a phrase that carried legal nuance, she leaned in gently. It implies renewal, not termination, she said softly. He adjusted his explanation immediately, watching the relief spread across the face of the woman seated across from him. There was something profoundly grounding about it. No stock prices, no power dynamics, just meaning delivered accurately. During a brief lull, Clara stepped outside for air. Ethan followed a moment later. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden lines across the sidewalk. She leaned lightly against the brick wall, eyes lifted toward the light. You are not restless anymore, she observed quietly as he joined her. I used to measure every hour by productivity, he replied. Now I measure it by impact. She glanced at him, assessing the truth behind the words. Impact is not always loud, she said. I know, he answered. Sometimes it is a corrected sentence. A small smile curved her lips. You remember. I remember everything, he said, not possessively, but with care. They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the city blending with distant laughter from inside the center. My mother asked about you, Clara said after a pause. Ethan looked at her, curious. And what did you tell her? That you were learning, she replied. She asked if you were kind. He absorbed the question thoughtfully. What did you say? Clara met his eyes steadily. I said yes. The simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any business accolade he had ever received. I want to meet her, he said quietly. Not to impress her, just to listen. Clara studied him carefully, then nodded. You will, she said. But remember, she measures people differently. So do you, he replied. The afternoon drifted into evening, and the event concluded with quiet gratitude from those who had received help. As they stacked chairs and gathered leftover papers, Clara reached for Ethan's hand without hesitation. The gesture felt natural now, integrated into their shared rhythm. There was a time, she said softly as they stepped back onto the sidewalk, when I thought love required grand gestures. And now, he asked. Now I think it requires presence, she answered. He squeezed her hand gently. Then I am here. They walked toward the small park across the street once more, settling onto the same bench where weeks earlier something had shifted between them. The air felt warmer now, softer. Do you ever miss who you were? She asked, her voice thoughtful rather than critical. He considered the question carefully. I do not miss the armor, he said at last. But I respect the boy who built it. He did what he thought he needed to survive. Clara leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, the gesture quiet and intimate. And the man you are now? She asked. He looked down at her, brushing his thumb gently across her knuckles. He is learning that survival is not the same as connection. She smiled against his shoulder. You speak differently now. I feel differently, he replied. The park lights flickered on one by one as dusk settled in. Around them, couples passed, children laughed, the ordinary world continuing without noticing the transformation that had taken place not in public spectacle, but in private discipline. You once tried to make yourself larger, she said softly. And you once refused to make yourself smaller, he answered. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze fully. We met in the middle. No, he corrected gently. We built something new. He leaned forward and pressed a soft, unhurried kiss to her lips, respectful and certain, not dramatic but deliberate. When he pulled back, their foreheads rested together briefly. We keep practicing, she whispered. Always, he replied. And as the city lights reflected in her gray eyes, Ethan understood that the most powerful language he had ever learned was not spoken in Italian or German or Farsi. It was spoken in consistency, in humility, in choosing to stand beside someone rather than above them. And Clara, who once corrected him across a restaurant table, now walked with him into every room not as a lesson, but as a partner. Autumn arrived quietly, brushing the city with cooler air and longer shadows, and with it came an invitation Ethan could not ignore. The annual Global Commerce Summit was approaching, an event where investors, diplomats, and executives from 5 continents gathered beneath one roof. In previous years, Ethan had treated it as a stage. This year, he treated it as a test. Clara stood in his office late one afternoon as golden light stretched across the skyline behind them. A printed program rested on the desk between them. They want you to open the summit in 3 languages, she observed, scanning the agenda. They always do, he replied. She looked up at him, searching his expression. And what do you want? He paused, the question settling deeper than logistics. I want to speak in one, he said slowly. Clearly. She nodded once, understanding the weight behind that choice. Then speak in the language that requires the most courage, she said softly. The night of the summit, the ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and tailored suits, conversations flowing in French, Mandarin, Spanish, and English. Clara stood near the side of the stage, not hidden, not spotlighted, simply present. She wore a simple black dress, elegant without excess. Ethan stepped to the podium, the low murmur of the crowd fading as the microphone carried his first breath across the room. He did not begin in Italian. He did not begin in German. He began in English. Good evening, he said calmly, his voice steady without performance. Tonight, I am not here to impress you with fluency. I am here to speak. With clarity, a subtle shift moved through the room. He continued, speaking about global partnerships not as conquests, but as collaborations, about language not as leverage, but as bridge. When he referenced translation, he acknowledged the unseen professionals who ensured meaning survived across borders. He did not name Clara, but he glanced toward her once, briefly, and she understood. Midway through his speech, a delegate from Europe raised a question in rapid French, layered with diplomatic nuance. Ethan listened fully before responding. Instead of answering immediately, He turned slightly toward Clara. Would you help me phrase this precisely? He asked, his tone respectful, public, intentional. A hush moved through the ballroom. Clara stepped forward with quiet confidence, translating the delegate's concern, then articulating Ethan's response with careful balance. There was no power shift, no spectacle, only partnership. When the exchange concluded, applause rose not explosively but steadily, a recognition of something rare, collaboration without ego. After the speech, clusters of guests approached Ethan with congratulations. He thanked them politely, but his eyes sought Clara across the room. When they finally stood side by side near the edge of the ballroom, the noise softened around them. You could have answered alone, she said quietly. I did not want to, he replied. I wanted to answer well. She studied him, the pride in her gaze unmistakable. You did. We did, he corrected gently. Later, as the crowd thinned and the city lights reflected in the tall windows, they stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the skyline. The air was crisp, carrying the distant sound of traffic below. This used to be my favorite part, Ethan admitted, resting his hands lightly on the railing. The applause. The recognition. Clara stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. And now, she asked. He turned toward her fully. Now it is this. He reached for her hand, interlacing their fingers naturally. Standing beside someone who makes me better without making me smaller. She smiled softly, the wind lifting a strand of her hair. You always had the ability, she said. You just needed to choose it. He exhaled, a quiet release of something old and unnecessary. When I first met you, he said, I thought language was power. It is, she replied gently, but only when used with care. He stepped closer, his voice lowering with sincerity. You changed the way I speak. She shook her head lightly. You changed because you wanted to. The distinction mattered. He understood that now. Below them, headlights moved like quiet rivers through the streets. Above them, the night sky stretched open and vast. I want this, he said, not vaguely, not abstractly. Not just partnership in rooms like that. I want mornings. I want ordinary days. I want to build something that does not need applause to exist. Clara's breath caught softly, not in surprise, but in recognition of the depth behind his words. You are speaking clearly, she whispered. I learned from the best, he replied. She laughed quietly, the sound warm against the cool air. He lifted her hand gently, pressing a soft, unhurried kiss against her knuckles, respectful and certain. Clara Whitmore, he said, his voice steady. I do not love you because you corrected me. I love you because you stood firm in who you are and invited me to stand beside you. Her eyes shimmered under the terrace lights. Ethan Caldwell, she answered softly. I love you because you chose growth over pride and partnership over performance. There was no audience now. No applause. Only the steady pulse of the city and the quiet understanding between them. He drew her closer, resting his forehead against hers, their hands still intertwined. In that moment, language was no longer about dominance or display. It was about promise. And as the skyline stretched endlessly behind them, they understood that the most powerful words are not the ones spoken to impress the world, but the ones spoken honestly to the person standing beside you. The morning after the summit did not begin with headlines or congratulatory messages, though they arrived steadily on Ethan's phone. It began with quiet. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of his penthouse, pale and soft, resting across the hardwood floors. Clara stood barefoot near the kitchen counter, reading an email on her tablet, her hair loosely gathered at the nape of her neck. There was no rush in her movements, no performance in the stillness. Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking. You are thinking, he said gently. She glanced up, offering a faint smile. I always am. He crossed the room slowly, pouring coffee into 2 simple white mugs instead of crystal cups. He handed one to her without a word. She accepted it, their fingers brushing briefly, a quiet ritual. Now familiar between them. The community center received 3 new partnership offers after last night, she said. Funding, translation technology, corporate sponsorship. Ethan leaned against the counter, listening carefully. And he asked. Clara studied his face. They want your name attached. He nodded once, unsurprised. Do you want it attached? She asked directly. He considered the question without defensiveness. Only if it serves the mission, he replied. Not the image. She searched his expression, looking for hesitation, for ambition dressed as humility. She found none. Then we decline the branding, she said quietly. We accept the resources. A small smile curved his lips. You negotiate differently than my board. I negotiate for impact, she replied. He stepped closer, resting his hand lightly at her waist, the gesture natural, unclaimed, respectful. I am learning that impact lasts longer than applause, he said. Later that afternoon, they walked together into the community center once more. Volunteers were already setting up for another session, this one focused on small business tax registration. Clara moved through the room with steady grace, checking forms, adjusting chairs. Ethan spoke with a few of the new sponsors, clarifying that their contributions would remain anonymous. No banners, he said calmly. No logos on the walls. One executive looked puzzled. You are walking away from visibility, the man remarked. Ethan glanced toward Clara across the room. No, he answered quietly. I am choosing integrity. The man nodded slowly, understanding dawning. As the event began, Clara addressed the group with calm authority. We are here to make language less intimidating, she said. Take your time. Ask questions. Clarity is not a luxury. It is a right. Ethan stood near the back, observing the quiet confidence in her posture. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. He simply supported. At one point, a young couple approached him with confusion over a licensing form. He knelt slightly to meet them at eye level rather than standing over them. Let us look at this together, he said gently. Clara noticed. She noticed everything. When the session ended and the last guest left with paperwork properly filed, they remained behind, stacking chairs in companionable silence. You could have taken credit tonight, she said softly. For the summit. For the partnerships. He shook his head. Credit is loud, he replied. What we are building is quiet. She paused, holding a folded chair in her hands, and looked at him with something deeper than pride. You are no longer translating to win, she said. You are translating to connect. He stepped toward her, taking the chair from her hands and setting it aside. And you are no longer correcting me, he replied gently. You are walking with me. The room fell silent around them, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. My mother would like to meet you this Sunday, Clara said after a moment. Ethan felt a flicker of nerves, honest and human. Does she know who I am? He asked. Clara smiled faintly. She knows who you are becoming. The distinction settled deeply within him. Then I will come, he said. She stepped closer, resting her hand over his heart lightly. No armor, she reminded him softly. No armor, he echoed. Sunday arrived with clear skies and crisp air. They walked up the steps of a modest townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, autumn leaves scattered across the sidewalk. Ethan carried a simple bouquet of white flowers, nothing extravagant. When the door opened, Clara's mother greeted them with gentle eyes and steady composure. She studied Ethan not with suspicion, but with discernment. Over dinner, there were no discussions of net worth or corporate achievements. There were questions about intention, about patience, about how he handled disagreement. Ethan answered honestly, without embellishment. At one point, Clara's mother asked, "Why do you love my daughter?" He did not hesitate. "Because she refuses to shrink," he said quietly. "And she challenges me to expand without losing myself." The older woman nodded slowly, satisfied not with status, but with sincerity. Later, as they walked back down the steps into the fading light, Clara slipped her hand into his. "You listened," she said softly. "I meant every word," he replied. They paused beneath a tree whose leaves shimmered gold against the evening sky. There were no cameras, no applause, no audience to witness the steady transformation that had begun months earlier across a restaurant table. Ethan looked at Clara with clarity he had never possessed before. "The language I am most grateful for," he said quietly, "is the one we are building together." She smiled, her gray eyes reflecting the soft light. "Then we keep speaking it," she whispered. And as they walked forward side by side, their pace unhurried and equal, it was clear that what had started as a correction had become a commitment. Not loud, not theatrical, just steady, just true. Winter settled over the city with a quiet authority, frost tracing delicate patterns along window edges and breath rising in soft clouds against the morning air. Ethan stood at the wide glass window of his office, watching snow fall in steady silence. Months earlier, he would have measured the day by market volatility and strategic advantage. Now, he measured it by alignment. Behind him, Clara sat at the long conference table reviewing a draft proposal for expanding the community center into a permanent nonprofit organization. Her posture was calm, her focus unwavering. If we formalize it, she said thoughtfully, we protect it from depending on any one person. Ethan turned from the window and walked toward her slowly. Even from me, he replied. She met his eyes, appreciative of the understanding behind the statement. Especially from you, she said gently. There was no accusation in her tone, only clarity. He nodded once. Then we build it to stand on its own. Over the next several weeks, they worked side by side not in spotlighted boardrooms, but in modest meeting spaces, drafting mission statements, outlining ethical guidelines, ensuring that language services would remain accessible and free. Ethan declined public recognition more than once. When a prominent business journal requested an exclusive interview about his philanthropic pivot, he responded with a brief statement that redirected focus to the volunteers. Clara watched him send the email without hesitation. That was your chance to shape the narrative, she said quietly. He smiled faintly. The narrative does not need shaping if the work is honest. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, a small gesture carrying deep affirmation. One evening, after a long planning session, they walked through the nearly empty streets, snow crunching lightly beneath their steps. Clara's scarf was wrapped loosely around her neck, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Ethan removed his gloves briefly to adjust the scarf more securely around her shoulders, his touch careful and unhurried. You take care of details, she observed softly. I am learning from you, he replied. They paused beneath a street lamp, light reflecting off fresh snow like scattered stars. Do you remember the first night? She asked suddenly. I remember every word, he answered. She smiled faintly. You were trying to control the room, and you refused to shrink. He said. The memory did not embarrass him anymore. It grounded him. I was afraid of being overlooked, he admitted quietly. So I made myself louder. Clara stepped closer, her gloved hands resting lightly against his coat. You are not overlooked now, she said, because you are present, not loud. The distinction settled warmly between them. In early spring, the nonprofit officially opened its doors in a larger, renovated space funded quietly through partnerships that did not bear Ethan's name. The opening ceremony was simple. Folding chairs, coffee and paper cups, a handwritten sign near the entrance that read Clarity builds community. Clara spoke briefly, her voice steady as she thanked volunteers and participants. Ethan stood to the side, listening with visible pride. When she finished, she sought his gaze in the crowd. Later, as the room emptied and the last guest departed with translated documents neatly organized in hand, Clara approached him near the doorway. This exists because you chose differently, she said softly. He shook his head gently. It exists because you never compromised your voice. She stepped into his space, her presence steady and warm. We chose together, she corrected. He slipped his hand into hers, their fingers interlacing naturally. I used to think success meant being the most fluent person in the room, he said quietly. Now I understand it means creating a room where everyone can speak. Her eyes reflected the soft overhead light, steady and sure. And love? She asked, almost teasing. He smiled, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Love means listening even when there is no applause. She laughed softly, the sound bright against the quiet hum of the building. You speak clearly now, she said. Only because you taught me how, he replied. She shook her head lightly. I did not teach you. I reminded you. They stepped outside together, the air cool but no longer harsh. The city felt less overwhelming than it once had, less like a stage and more like a shared landscape. Do you ever wish we had met differently? She asked as they walked slowly down the sidewalk. Ethan considered the question carefully. No, he said at last. Because if I had met you without being challenged, I might not have understood what I was missing. She nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the sharpest correction leads to the clearest path, she said. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. There was no urgency in his movement, no dramatic flourish. Just certainty. Clara Whitmore, he said gently, his voice steady in the open air. You changed the way I measure worth, the way I use my voice, the way I show up in the world. I do not want a life that does not include you. Her breath caught softly, not in surprise, but in recognition of what had long been building. Ethan Caldwell, she answered quietly. You chose growth when pride would have been easier. I do not want a future that does not include you either. Snow from weeks earlier had melted, replaced by small green shoots pushing through soil along the curb. He drew her into a warm embrace. Unhurried and certain, their connection rooted not in spectacle but in steady practice. And as they stood there beneath the quiet sky, it was clear that the most powerful language they had learned was not spoken in foreign phrases or public speeches. It was spoken in humility, in consistency, and in the simple decision to stand beside one another without armor. Spring matured into early summer, and with it came a quiet steadiness neither of them had rushed toward, but both had chosen deliberately. The nonprofit had been operating for 3 months, and every Saturday the small office filled with families, entrepreneurs, and students seeking clarity in a system that often felt overwhelming. Clara moved through the space with the same calm precision she once carried between restaurant tables, but now her role had expanded. She trained new volunteers, reviewed complex documents, and ensured that no translation sacrificed dignity for speed. Ethan watched her from across the room one afternoon as sunlight streamed through the front windows, catching the fine dust in the air like suspended gold. He did not see a waitress. He did not see a correction. He saw a leader. After the last appointment ended, Clara closed a folder and looked up at him. "You are observing again," she said softly. "I am appreciating," he replied. She smiled faintly. "That is different." He stepped closer, resting his hand lightly at the small of her back as they surveyed the now quiet room. "There was a time when I thought influence required volume," he said. "Now I see it requires consistency." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "Consistency builds trust," she said. "Trust builds community." He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, respectful and warm. "You built this," he murmured. She turned slightly in his arms. "We built this," she corrected. That evening, they returned to the restaurant where everything had begun. Not for nostalgia, not for spectacle, simply for dinner. The owner greeted Clara with a proud embrace, and the staff smiled warmly at Ethan, no longer seeing him as the man who once performed for a table, but as the one who now asked about their families and meant it. They chose a small table near the window, the same one where their first correction had shifted everything. "Do you ever think about how easily this could have gone differently?" Clara asked as she folded her napkin carefully. Ethan considered the question. "If you had stayed silent," he asked. She nodded. "Then I would have walked out that night unchanged," he said quietly. "And I would have missed the most important partnership of my life." She reached across the table, her fingers resting over his. "You chose to come back," she reminded him. "You chose to listen. Because you made silence feel heavier than pride," he replied. The waiter brought their meals, and for a moment they ate without speaking, comfortable in shared quiet. The restaurant hummed around them, plates clinking softly, conversations overlapping gently. "I have been thinking," Ethan said after a while. Clara raised an eyebrow slightly. "You are always thinking." He smiled. "About the future." Her gaze softened. "What about it?" He exhaled slowly, not out of nerves, but out of intention. "I do not want separate paths that intersect occasionally. I want a shared direction. A life built on what we practice, not just what we feel." Clara studied him carefully, the weight of his words settling between them. "You are speaking of permanence," she said quietly. "I am," he replied. There was no dramatic pause, no grand gesture hidden beneath the table, just steadiness. "Not because it is expected," he continued, "but because it feels aligned." She leaned back slightly, considering. "Permanence is not proven by promises," she said. "It is proven by pattern." He nodded once. "Then look at the pattern," he answered. She did. She saw the months of presence, the refusal to take credit, the choice to stand beside her in rooms that once intimidated him, the way he listened before responding, the way he corrected himself before she needed to. She reached for his hand again, this time holding it more firmly. "Then let us continue the pattern," she said softly. "Not rushed, not pressured, just steady." He smiled, relief and certainty blending in his expression. "Steady," he echoed. When they stepped outside into the warm evening air, the city felt familiar and new at the same time. They walked slowly down the sidewalk, passing the cafe where they once practiced listening, the corner where he first admitted he wanted to deserve her. "You know," Clara said gently, "love did not arrive the night you said it." "No," he agreed. "It arrived in small corrections. In returning. In staying." She slipped her arm through his. That is why it feels strong, she said. It was built. They paused beneath a string of soft patio lights glowing above the sidewalk. Ethan turned to face her fully, brushing his thumb lightly along her jawline. Whatever comes next, he said quietly, I want to meet it with you. Not above you. Not ahead of you. With you. Her gray eyes reflected the warm lights overhead. Then we will, she answered. And as they continued walking, side by side in the gentle hum of early summer night, it was clear that what began as a moment of correction had evolved into something far deeper. Not a fairy tale, not a performance, but a deliberate, practiced love rooted in clarity, humility, and the quiet courage to listen before speaking. The late summer air carried the scent of warm pavement and distant rain as Clara locked the door of the nonprofit office one evening, the soft click echoing gently in the quiet street. Ethan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, no longer dressed like a man preparing for battle, but like someone prepared for presence. Months had passed since the first correction across a white tablecloth, and what had grown between them was not fragile. It was deliberate. It was practiced. It was steady. The organization now operated 5 days a week, serving families from more than 20 countries. Volunteers rotated shifts with quiet discipline. Documents that once intimidated now became manageable. Clarity had become contagious. Ethan had stepped back from several corporate boards that demanded constant travel, choosing instead to restructure his company's leadership to allow sustainable growth without his constant dominance. Investors had questioned the decision at first. He had answered calmly, growth that consumes everything is not growth. It is hunger. Clara had watched him during those meetings, seated at the far end of long tables, not intervening unless necessary. He no longer looked to her for validation. He looked to her as a compass. On a Friday evening, as sunlight stretched long across the city skyline, Ethan stood inside the empty nonprofit office after closing, arranging folding chairs in a semicircle. Clara entered quietly, noticing the arrangement immediately. We are not hosting a workshop tonight, she said gently. He turned, a faint smile touching his expression. No, he replied. We are hosting a conversation. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. There was no nervousness in his posture, no dramatic intensity. Only intention. Sit with me, he said softly. She took one of the chairs, folding her hands in her lap, composed as always. Ethan remained standing for a moment, absorbing the room. This space had once been a borrowed classroom with uneven paint and borrowed desks. Now it carried the steady hum of something permanent. He sat across from her, not above, not beside. Across. Equal distance. Equal ground. When I first walked into your restaurant, he began quietly. I believed language was a tool to establish hierarchy. I believed intelligence was measured by who could command the room fastest. Clara listened, her eyes steady. You corrected more than my grammar that night, he continued. You corrected my posture toward people. She offered a small, reflective smile. You chose to be corrected, she replied. That matters. He nodded once. And every day since, I have tried to choose alignment over ego. Silence rested gently between them, not empty, but full of memory. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, not theatrically, and withdrew a small velvet box. Clara's breath softened, but did not quicken with shock. She had sensed something approaching not because of suspense, but because of consistency. Ethan opened the box with steady hands, revealing a simple ring. No oversized diamond. No excessive display. Just a clean band with a single stone that reflected light quietly rather than demanding it. I do not want to own your future, he said, his voice calm and clear. I want to walk into it with you. Not as the loudest voice. Not as the most powerful presence. But as your partner. Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? The room did not erupt. There were no hidden cameras. Only the hum of the overhead light and the distant sound of traffic through the windows. Clara looked at him for a long moment, her gray eyes reflecting not surprise, but reflection. Marriage, she said softly, is another language. He smiled faintly. Then teach me. She rose slowly from her chair and stepped toward him. He did not kneel dramatically. Instead, he remained seated until she stood directly before him. Then he rose to meet her at eye level. I will marry you, she said quietly. Not because you changed for me, but because you changed with me. Not because you speak beautifully, but because you listen carefully. And not because you stand tall, but because you stand beside. The words settled like a foundation stone. He slid the ring gently onto her finger, his hand steady. It fit as though it had always belonged there. He exhaled softly, not with relief, but with gratitude. She rested her hands against his chest lightly, feeling the calm rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palms. No armor, she reminded him softly. No armor, he echoed. Months later, beneath a wide autumn sky, they stood in a small outdoor ceremony in the courtyard behind the nonprofit office. There were no celebrity guests, no corporate sponsors, no extravagant arches. Folding chairs lined the courtyard, filled with volunteers, restaurant staff, community families, and Clara's mother seated proudly in the front row. Ethan wore a simple dark suit without a flashy watch. Clara wore an elegant ivory dress that moved gently in the breeze. When it was time to speak, there were no elaborate vows written by professionals. Ethan spoke first. "You taught me that language without humility is noise," he said. "You showed me that correction can be compassion. And you proved that partnership is not about standing ahead, but about standing equal." Clara's voice followed, steady and warm. "You showed me that pride can bend without breaking. You showed me that growth is not weakness. And you proved that love is not declared loudly, but practiced daily." When they exchanged rings, there was no overwhelming music, only the quiet rustle of leaves and the soft applause of those who had witnessed their journey. Afterward, instead of a grand reception, there was a shared meal prepared by volunteers and friends. Long tables, simple food, laughter that felt earned rather than displayed. As evening settled and string lights glowed softly above the courtyard, Ethan and Clara stood slightly apart from the crowd for a moment. "Are you happy?" he asked gently. She looked at the room filled with lives they had touched together, then back at him. "I am aligned," she answered. He smiled, understanding that alignment, for them, meant peace. Years would pass, and their life would continue in the same pattern it began. Boardrooms balanced by community rooms. Strategic meetings balanced by quiet dinners at the restaurant where it all started. Occasional disagreements resolved not by dominance, but by dialogue. When Ethan's company expanded internationally, he ensured that translation services were integrated into every branch, not as an afterthought, but as a principle. When Clara trained new leaders for the nonprofit, she reminded them that language carries dignity, and dignity must never be rushed. They built a home that reflected the same philosophy. Not oversized, not showy. Sunlight through wide windows. Bookshelves filled with dictionaries, novels, policy manuals, and handwritten notes from families they had helped. On quiet evenings, they would sit by the window with cups of tea, reviewing plans, or simply watching the city breathe below. "Do you regret correcting me?" Ethan asked once, half smiling. Clara shook her head. "Do you regret being corrected?" she countered. He considered, then shook his head as well. "It was the clearest sentence anyone ever spoke to me." She leaned her head against his shoulder, comfortable in shared silence. Their love did not rely on grand declarations. It relied on returning, on listening, on standing equal even when circumstances shifted. When challenges arose, as they inevitably do, they faced them not as opponents, but as translators of one another's fears and hopes. And whenever someone asked how they met, Clara would smile gently and say, "He ordered dinner." Ethan would add, and she answered. In the end, what remained was not the memory of a billionaire trying to impress a room, but the story of a woman who refused to shrink and a man who chose to grow. They did not raise their voices. They raised their standard. And in doing so, they built a language of love that required no applause, only practice, only presence, only the quiet courage to listen before speaking. If this journey moved you, share where you are watching from and share your thoughts. Do not forget to leave a comment and tell us how you would rate this story. Stay with us for more stories. Press like and subscribe so you do not miss the next stories from our channel Love After Everything.